They laughed when I entered the restaurant, my restaurant, because I didn't look the part anymore. That's how I remember it beginning, a ripple of laughter, not cruel at first, just the kind that passes between people who think they're safe inside, their own assumptions. I stood there in the doorway, holding my old navy coat over my arm, the one I used to wear when I'd stay after closing to count the receipts and lock the back door. It smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon oil, the same scent I'd chosen for the dining room 35 years ago when I opened the place with my husband. The sound of glassware and conversation rolled toward me like warm air, and for a moment I thought I'd made a mistake, that I should turn around and go home. But home, lately, had become a smaller word than I remembered. I took a breath and stepped inside. No one recognized me at first, and why should they? Time had changed the shape of my body, softened my jawline, thinned my hair to the color of frost. The hostess was a young girl with sharp eyeliner and a tablet instead of a reservation book. She looked up, gave me a professional smile, and asked if I had a booking. I told her I didn't need one. The corner table by the window, my table, was already filled with a loud party of 20. I knew them, or at least I knew their names. My son, my granddaughter, the new in-laws, the celebration I wasn't invited to. It was her wedding brunch, the one I learned about by accident, scrolling through the family messages that were never meant for me. Someone had written, "We'll all meet at Petra's." They still used my name, though I suppose they meant it differently now. I remember smoothing my dress, trying to decide whether to wave or wait to be noticed. I stood too long, awkwardly, until one of the guests whispered something to the others, and laughter bubbled up again. They thought I was a lost customer, some lonely old woman who had wandered into the wrong kind of restaurant. I felt the sting before I even understood it. It wasn't just that they didn't see me. It was that they saw through me, like I'd been erased from the frame. My granddaughter's new husband was the first to spot me properly. His expression shifted from confusion to discomfort, the kind you feel when someone breaks a rule you didn't realize you'd made. Then my son turned, and I watched the recognition drain the color from his face. He stood quickly, murmuring something to his wife, and came toward me with that tight smile people wear when they want to look kind but are really furious. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked quietly, as though I'd crashed a funeral instead of the brunch held under my name. I said I'd come to congratulate the bride. He told me I should have called first. I told him I didn't know I needed permission to visit a place I'd built with my own hands. His wife appeared behind him, sleek and immaculate, her perfume all citrus and distance. She said, "We just didn't think you'd want to come, given your health." My health. The word landed like an insult disguised as concern. I almost laughed because I'd been on my feet 14 hours a day when this woman was still in high school. I could have told her about the winters I'd worked through pneumonia because the payroll depended on me, but I didn't. I only said, "My health's fine. It's the invitation that seems to have been under the weather." They didn't like that. I could see it in the small twitch of my son's mouth, the silent plea to just go along, to make it easy, to disappear gracefully. It was always the same request, just dressed in new clothes. The table behind him was full of people laughing, glasses clinking, someone toasting with a mimosa raised high. The decor had changed since my time, lighter colors, trendier chairs, but the bones were mine. The old brick wall I'd insisted on leaving exposed was still there, the faint outline of the original logo just visible under the new paint. "Petra's," it had said once, in looping gold letters. They'd repainted the sign to match the granddaughter's name, but the shape of the P was still the same. I felt a kind of dizzy calm, the way you feel when the truth is too sharp to touch directly. I realized that everyone in the room was watching now, curious, uncomfortable, waiting for me to retreat. The manager appeared from the kitchen, older than I expected, though not as old as me, and for a moment his eyes darted past me like he didn't quite believe what he saw. Then recognition dawned. Ms. Rivera? He said, not loud but clear enough that the nearest tables heard. My son stiffened. His wife's smile froze. The manager came closer, extending his hand. It's been a long time. I wasn't sure you'd ever come back. There it was, the small tilt of power, the quiet rearranging of respect. I didn't need to announce myself after that. He gestured toward the front of the room, offering me a seat, but I declined. I only wanted to stand for a moment, to breathe in the air that still smelled faintly of garlic and rosemary, and something else, memory maybe. The manager asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, and he went himself to pour it, not sending a waiter. When he returned, the laughter had died down. The brunch chatter resumed, thinner, nervous, like everyone had forgotten their lines. I took a sip and felt the heat spread through my chest. I thought about the day I'd opened the place, how I'd stood in this same room wearing a borrowed dress, praying the ovens wouldn't fail and that at least a few people would come. They did. By evening, the line stretched out the door. I'd been called many things since then: businesswoman, widow, workhorse, but never invisible. Until that morning. My son cleared his throat and asked if I'd like to sit with them. The words were polite, but hollow, as though they'd been dug up from somewhere he didn't believe in. I said no, thank you. I just wanted to see the place. His wife muttered something about creating a scene, but I barely heard her. My eyes were fixed on the framed photograph above the bar, a black and white shot of the restaurant in its first year. I was in that picture once, standing beside my husband, flower on my cheek, pride in my eyes. In this version, the frame was the same, but I was gone, cropped out neatly, as if I'd never existed. I stood there longer than I should have, I suppose, long enough for discomfort to bloom around the room like a slow contagion. Then I smiled, not bitterly, but with the kind of peace that comes when you've already survived worse. I told the manager I'd like to pay for the family's meal quietly, without announcement. He looked surprised but nodded. I signed the receipt with the same steady hand that had once signed the ownership papers. The pen didn't tremble. Before I left, I turned back toward the table. My granddaughter looked up at me, uncertain, maybe even curious. I wanted to say something to her, something small and real, but the words refused to come. She didn't know me, not truly. To her, I was just a rumor of a woman, the ghost behind a name on a menu. I thought about the years between us, the silences I'd let grow because I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. That was my mistake, thinking comfort was love. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright after the soft haze of the dining room. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign above the door. They'd repainted it white and gold, new letters, new life. But underneath, I could still see the faint trace of what used to be. The laughter inside had already resumed, but I didn't mind. Let them laugh. They'd forgotten that everything they were standing on, every chair, every wall, every spoon polished to a gleam, had once passed through my hands. They could erase the photographs, rename the dishes, even pretend I was gone, but the foundation remained mine. And someday, when they were older and the world began to shrink around them, they'd remember how it felt to stand where they didn't belong. And maybe then they'd understand what they'd done. I walked away slowly, not out of weakness, but because I wanted to feel every step. Every inch of ground was something I'd earned. I passed the corner where the first delivery truck had broken down on opening day, the alley where I'd once sat crying over a failed batch of bread, the spot where my husband used to park and wait for me after closing. All of it was still there, unchanged, waiting. And as I turned the corner, I realized I wasn't walking away from them at all. I was walking back toward myself, toward the woman who had built something from nothing and lived long enough to see it survive without her. That's not tragedy. That's legacy. And sometimes, legacy looks like an old woman in a navy coat, smiling faintly at her reflection in a window she once cleaned with her own hands. It began, as most betrayals do, not with cruelty, but with convenience. A few days after that awkward brunch, when the laughter and whispers had faded into memory, my son called. It was evening, that hour when the light softens and you can almost mistake peace for forgiveness. His voice was careful, the kind of tone that comes from rehearsing empathy. He said he wanted to clear the air, which I've learned means rearranging the truth until it flatters the speaker. He explained that the brunch had been a mix-up, that they'd meant to include me, but things got hectic with the wedding, the guest list, the seating chart. I listened quietly, tracing the rim of my teacup with one finger, waiting for the apology that never came. He went on about stress and misunderstanding, about how I should have known they wanted me there, in spirit. I told him I preferred to attend in body, since I'm still in possession of one. He sighed, a long theatrical sigh that reminded me of his father when he was losing an argument. Then he said, "Mom, maybe it's just time to let go. You've done enough for all of us. Maybe you should just enjoy retirement." Retirement, that word again. As if love had a pension plan, as if a mother could clock out. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in my small apartment felt thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and resentment. I opened the window, letting the salt wind from the bay curl into the room, and I thought about all the things I'd built that had quietly been taken from me, not stolen in the dramatic way of movies or novels, but absorbed like water into cloth until it was impossible to tell where I ended and they began. I had signed the restaurant over years ago, partly out of trust, partly out of exhaustion. My husband had already passed, and my son had promised to handle the logistics. He said it was safer, that taxes would be easier, that he'd take care of everything. And I, fool that I was, believed him. I thought family meant continuity. I didn't realize that sometimes family just means the next set of hands waiting to take what's still warm. The next morning, a letter arrived from the restaurant's new management company, my son's company, though he liked to hide behind logos. It was polite, printed on thick cream paper, the kind that tries to look dignified. It thanked me for my early contributions to the founding of Petra's and invited me to a special donor luncheon to celebrate the restaurant's ongoing legacy. My name wasn't listed on the guest speakers or the owner's page, just under honored contributors, between a retired chef and a supplier of table linens. My own restaurant had demoted me to an accessory. I sat there with that letter trembling in my hands, not from rage, but from the sheer absurdity of it. They were going to honor me by pretending I was dead. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I put on the same navy coat, pressed the dress I'd worn the day of our grand opening, and arrived exactly on time. The dining room was bright, almost too bright, the kind of light that flattens everything. There were banners printed with phrases like, "Tradition meets modern excellence," and "Celebrating the spirit of innovation." I almost laughed because I remembered when innovation meant finding cheaper flour without sacrificing texture, when tradition meant scraping grease off the stoves before dawn. I recognized a few of the guests, old suppliers, local journalists, but most of them were strangers, sleek young people with company badges who used words like brand synergy without irony. My son was there, of course, in a tailored suit, moving through the crowd like a man giving tours of a museum he didn't curate. When he saw me, his smile faltered, just for a second. "Mom," he said too softly, "you didn't need to come." I looked at him and thought how strange it was that the child I had once held to my chest now looked at me like a liability. "You invited me," I said. He shook his head gently. "Not me. That was the committee. It's just symbolic." I asked him, "Symbolic of what?" And he looked away. The event began with a slideshow, photographs of the restaurant through the decades, its growth, its renovations, its supposed evolution. They had my recipes, my handwriting, my decor, but not my name. Not once did the screen show my face, though I recognized my hands in the old kitchen shots, rolling dough, stirring sauce, polishing glass. They called it heritage content. The host, a young woman with a headset and a rehearsed smile, introduced my son as the visionary who built Petra's into what it is today. Visionary. The word scraped something raw in me. When I started that place, I had one pair of shoes, one loan, and a promise to a dying husband that I'd keep us afloat. My vision was survival. His was branding. When they finally called me to the stage, it was as an afterthought. The host said, "And now, a few words from the woman who inspired it all." Inspired. It sounded like something abstract, like wind or wallpaper. I walked up slowly, feeling the eyes on me. My son was tense, his wife biting her lip. I could have smiled, said something gracious, but my mouth refused the script they expected. I said instead, "I used to think legacy meant leaving something behind, but now I see it can also mean being left behind." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The host tried to laugh it off, but no one joined. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke the way I always had in that kitchen. Steady, measured, sure of the recipe. "I built this place," I said, "with my own hands and my husband's faith. We didn't have investors or consultants. We had a stove that smoked and a dream that burned. You can rename it, repaint it, even rewrite it, but don't pretend I was never here." Silence held the room like a storm about to break. My son whispered something to the host, and she quickly thanked me, ushering me off stage as if I were a fragile relic. I returned to my table, where no one met my eyes. The applause that followed was polite and hollow, the kind people give out of obligation, not respect. But I didn't mind. Something had shifted in me, quiet but irreversible. I realized then that I had spent my entire life asking to be remembered when I should have been remembering myself. After the luncheon, as people filed out, the manager approached me again, the same man from the brunch. His voice was low. "You know," he said, "most of the staff still call it Petra's because of you." He smiled almost shyly. "They tell new hires. She used to sit by the kitchen door during lunch rushes so she could hear every order." I felt something catch in my throat, something tender and dangerous. "Do they still keep the old ledger?" I asked. He nodded. "Locked in the office safe. We never threw it out." That ledger was my diary. Every recipe tested, every mistake recorded, every triumph scrawled in grease and ink. I thought it had been lost years ago. I left the event without saying goodbye. Outside, the sky had turned a heavy gray, that color between rain and regret. I walked down the block toward the old pier, my steps slow but certain. The sea smelled like it always had, salt and truth. I sat on a bench and watched the gulls fight over crumbs, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel defeated. I felt awake. Betrayal has a way of clarifying the air, stripping away everything that was ornamental. I saw my life as it truly was, not a story of loss, but of ownership. They could own the name, the building, the narrative, but the soul of it, the hunger that built it brick by brick, was still mine. That evening, I wrote my son a letter. I told him I wouldn't be attending any more family events, not until someone in that family remembered who I was. I told him I didn't need to sit at their tables anymore because I still had one of my own, and I ended it with the truth I'd avoided for too long. You didn't inherit me, Daniel. You borrowed me, and now the loan is due. I sealed the envelope, placed it on the counter by the window, and poured myself a glass of wine. Outside, the last light of the day bent across the horizon, soft and red like a healing wound. I didn't toast to revenge. I toasted to recognition. Mine finally returned to its rightful owner. The days that followed the luncheon unfolded with a strange stillness, as if the world itself had paused to see what I would do next. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I moved through my small apartment like someone cataloging a life that no longer fit inside its walls. My son hadn't responded to my letter, and I hadn't expected him to. Silence had become his way of maintaining control. Quiet was his weapon, absence his reply. Yet the quiet this time felt different, lighter somehow, like the air after a storm when the wreckage still glistens, but the worst has already passed. I began waking earlier, not to cook for anyone or to prep for a lunch rush, but simply to sit by the window with my coffee and watch the street breathe itself awake. There's a kind of clarity that comes after humiliation, a stripped-down version of sight, where everything false loses its shine. For years I had measured my worth through usefulness, who needed me, who called, who depended on my steadiness. And now that no one did, I began to realize that freedom can sound a lot like being forgotten. One morning, around the end of summer, I decided to walk to the restaurant, not inside, just past it. It was early enough that the windows were still dark, and the street smelled faintly of bread and rain. I stood across the road watching the cleaners mop the foyer, the same tiled floor I had chosen 3 decades earlier from a catalog I couldn't afford at the time. It had taken me 6 months of saved tips to pay for that floor, because I wanted it to last longer than I would. And it had. I wondered if anyone who swept it now knew the story of those tiles. How I'd argued with the contractor who said the color, deep umber with faint marbling, was too dark, too moody for a restaurant. People like brightness, he'd said. Then let them bring their own, I'd replied. He'd laughed, but I didn't change my mind. Looking at it now through the glass, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Time could polish away credit, but not intention. I kept walking, passing the line of boutiques that had replaced the butcher shop, the corner grocer, the old bookstand where my husband used to buy the paper. The neighborhood had grown glossy, as if someone had stretched a film of money over its bones. It looked successful, but it had lost its smell. Back then, the street had reeked of onions, coffee, and the sea. Now it smelled of nothing but cleanliness. A black car slowed beside me, and for a moment I thought it might be my son, but it was only a stranger checking for parking. I laughed at myself quietly, realizing how easily old habits return, the reflex of expecting him, waiting for his validation like sunlight that never quite reaches your side of the street. I walked on. When I got home, a message was waiting on my answering machine. I hadn't used the thing in months, but the blinking red light felt almost intimate. The voice was unfamiliar, formal, female. She introduced herself as a representative from the Board of Culinary Heritage Preservation, a grand title for what used to be a local guild of restaurateurs, and said They were compiling a feature on the evolution of family-run establishments. She wanted to confirm a few historical details about Petra's, since there seems to be some confusion over the original ownership. I almost dropped the receiver. Confusion, she'd said. That was a polite way of describing erasure. I called her back before I could think better of it. Her name was Lillian, and her tone was brisk but not unkind. She said she'd been researching old business registrations and noticed that my name appeared on the founding documents, but not on the current list of proprietors. "We're trying to trace the lineage accurately," she said. "Would you be open to a short interview?" I agreed. 2 days later, she came to my apartment, carrying a digital recorder and a notebook. She was in her 40s, maybe, wearing sensible shoes and the kind of curiosity that can't be faked. I made tea. She asked questions about the early years, the financing, the recipes, the staff. I told her everything, not with bitterness, but with the precision of someone who's finally allowed to speak. As I described the long nights, the broken ovens, the first regulars who'd become like family, I saw her expression shift from polite interest to quiet astonishment. "So you handled everything yourself in the beginning?" she asked. "Everything except the plumbing," I said, "and even that once or twice." We both laughed, but under the laughter was something else, a reckoning. Before she left, she asked for a photograph, something from those early years. I hesitated, then went to my bedroom and pulled out an old frame from the bottom of a drawer. It was the same picture they'd cropped for the restaurant wall, me and my husband in the kitchen, smiling like we owned the world, because we did then. After she left, I felt lighter, almost giddy. It wasn't pride exactly. It was the strange relief of being witnessed after years of invisibility. But that feeling didn't last long. The next morning, my son called again. His voice was sharp this time. No rehearsed kindness, just accusation. "Why are you talking to journalists?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea what that could do to the brand?" The brand, that word again, as though the restaurant were a product, not a memory. I said I was simply telling the truth. "Your version of it," he snapped. "Mom, you're making things harder for everyone. You can't just show up in people's lives and rewrite history." I almost laughed. "Rewrite history?" I said. "I'm the one who wrote it in the first place." He didn't respond right away. Then he sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced by his own conscience, and said, "Maybe we should get coffee, talk this out." I told him I'd think about it. I never did. That afternoon, I walked down to the waterfront and bought a notebook from a souvenir stall. The cover was blue, the color of old denim, and the pages smelled faintly of glue. I started writing, not a memoir exactly, just memories. The real ones, the ones that had teeth. The day we signed the lease, the time a storm flooded the kitchen, and we worked barefoot in ankle-deep water, laughing like fools because the power had gone out, but the customers wouldn't leave. The first dollar we earned, which I'd taped to the inside of the register until the paper yellowed. I wrote for hours until the sun slid behind the horizon and my hand ached. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it all, but I knew one thing. Silence was no longer an option. Over the next week, small signs of resistance began to surface in the world beyond me. A food blog published an article titled "The Forgotten Women Behind the City's Dining Landmarks." It mentioned Petra's by name and quoted Lillian's interview. My phone rang constantly after that. Old employees, old customers, people who had eaten there 20 years ago and still remembered the smell of my tomato stew. They called to thank me, to share memories, to say my name out loud. "Petra Rivera," they said, as though tasting it. I hadn't realized how hungry I was to hear it spoken without correction. My son didn't call again, but his silence had a new edge to it, defensive now, panicked. One evening, I walked past the restaurant again and noticed something different. The framed photo above the bar, the one they'd cropped, had been removed. In its place hung a landscape, generic and meaningless. Erasure of a different kind, perhaps, but I didn't mind. You can't erase what people already remember. Still, the attention unsettled me. I'd spent years shrinking myself to fit into the spaces left for me, and now the sudden expansion felt almost dangerous. I caught myself apologizing to strangers for speaking too long, for taking up space in conversation. Old habits, like ghosts, don't leave just because you ask them to. But then one morning, while reading the newspaper, I saw my name printed in black ink under the headline, "Local Pioneer to be Honored at Culinary Heritage Gala." I laughed out loud, the sound startling even to me. It wasn't vindication, it was irony. The same people who had watched me fade into the background now wanted me to stand on their stage again, this time as a symbol of resilience. I didn't attend. I sent a short note instead. "I'm busy cooking." It was true, in a way. That night I made my old stew recipe, the one they'd replaced with a minimalist reduction. I filled the kitchen with the smell of garlic, basil, and heat. I cooked like I used to, without measuring, without apology, and as the steam fogged the window, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt that particular joy, the joy of creating something no one else could claim. After dinner, I stepped onto the balcony with a glass of wine and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck rattled down the road toward the restaurant district. I thought of the young servers there, wiping tables, laughing in the kitchen, maybe whispering about the story they'd read online. "Did you know the original owner still lives nearby?" they might say. "They say she walks past sometimes, checking if the tables are straight." I smiled at the thought. Let them tell it however they like. The truth has already started breathing again. That was how the first escalation began, not with confrontation or victory, but with quiet reclamation. I didn't storm in or demand my due. I simply started existing out loud again, and the world, startled, began to adjust. They had expected me to fade, but instead I returned, not as a ghost, but as a mirror. Every time they tried to look away, they saw themselves reflected in what they had done. And I, for the first time in years, saw myself clearly too. Not a relic, not a victim, but the root they'd built everything on. The soil doesn't shout, but it always remembers the seeds. The shift came quietly, the way dawn arrives, unannounced, inevitable, and only noticeable once it has already changed the color of everything. I didn't plan it, and I can't point to a single morning when I woke up deciding to begin again, but one day the rhythm of my life altered in some subtle, irreversible way. I stopped looking backward as much. I stopped waiting for apologies or recognition or whatever strange mixture of validation and punishment I used to crave from my son and the people who thought they'd buried me under the polite rubble of family silence. Instead, I began looking for something simpler, proof of motion, signs of life, the sense that I still had the capacity to shape my days instead of merely enduring them. The newspaper article that mentioned my name had triggered a wave of phone calls, a few invitations, and even a proposal from a local university to speak at a seminar about female entrepreneurship in the 20th century, which made me laugh. Because I had never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I had been a woman trying to pay rent and feed a dream. If that's what they wanted to label me now, I could let them. Still, I declined. Talking about survival to an audience of polite note-takers didn't interest me. I had spoken enough for other people's comfort. What I wanted was silence of my own making, the kind that heals instead of erases. One afternoon, I walked to the old pier again. The air smelled of salt and engine grease, the way it had when my husband and I used to come here to argue about everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. I sat on the same bench where he'd once told me he believed I was born to run things. I had laughed at him then, accused him of romantic exaggeration, but I see now he was right in a way neither of us understood. Running things is just another way of refusing to disappear. That thought stayed with me as I watched a group of teenagers dive off the end of the pier, reckless and loud, their laughter echoing across the water. I envied them, not their youth, but their certainty that they belonged to themselves. I had spent decades belonging to everyone else, my husband, my son, the business, the customers. It had never occurred to me that ownership could be a form of captivity. That evening, while sorting through the papers on my desk, I came across an envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a check from the Culinary Heritage Committee, a small honorarium for the interview, along with a note that read, "Thank you for helping us preserve history." I stared at the line for a long time. Preserve history. I wasn't a jar of jam. I didn't want to be preserved. I wanted to live. But money, no matter how symbolic, is energy. I took it as a sign and deposited it the next day. Then I withdrew half of it in cash and did something impulsive. I took a taxi to the edge of town, where the restaurant's old supplier, an aging Italian man named Carlo, still kept a warehouse full of unused furniture and equipment. He looked almost shocked to see me. "Petra," he cried, using the name like a blessing. "I thought you'd moved away, or worse." I told him worse had already happened, and that I was still standing. We sat at his little metal desk, surrounded by stacks of chairs and dusty glassware, and he poured us each a cup of bitter espresso from a dented machine. Carlo had been there from the beginning, the one who gave us credit when no one else would, who believed that two stubborn dreamers could turn a half-ruined bakery into a restaurant. We talked for hours about those early years, the chaos and the laughter and the impossible exhaustion. Before I left, he led me into the back room where a few old tables were stacked under a tarp. "These were from your first batch," he said. "Solid oak. You paid them off over 6 months, remember?" I did. He offered to sell them back to me for next to nothing. I hesitated, not knowing what I would do with them, but something inside me said yes. I chose 1 table and 2 chairs, had them delivered to my apartment the next morning, and spent half the day polishing them until the wood glowed like memory made tangible. When I set them near the window, the space changed. Suddenly my apartment didn't feel like a holding cell between past and oblivion. It felt like a place again. That table became my anchor. I wrote there, ate there, sometimes just sat for hours tracing the grain with my fingertips. It reminded me that creation doesn't end with recognition. It ends when you stop caring whether anyone notices. Around the same time, I began to go out more. Not to the restaurant, not yet, but to places that smelled of life. The market on Sundays, where old women sold bread and gossip. The library, where the young librarian always smiled like she knew I was writing something secret. The park, where I'd sit on a bench with a thermos of coffee and listen to strangers talk. The world had texture again. One afternoon, while walking through the market, I heard someone call my name. It was the restaurant's current manager, the same man who'd greeted me that first painful day. He was carrying a box of vegetables. "Ms. Rivera," he said breathlessly. We've been trying to reach you. There's something you should know. My stomach tightened, that old reflex of bracing for bad news. But his expression wasn't nervous, just earnest. After the article came out, people started asking questions, regulars from the early years. Some of them came by asking for your recipes, your stew, your bread. The owner, your son, decided to bring back a few of the classics. We've renamed a dish after you. Petra's roast. It's on the new menu. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Does he think that's forgiveness? I asked. The manager shook his head. I think it's panic, he said softly. People don't like the new stuff as much. They miss what was real. That night I went home and made the roast myself, just to see if I remembered every step. I did. The smell filled the apartment, and for the first time in years, I invited someone over to share it. Her name was Gloria, my neighbor across the hall, a retired teacher who had a sharp tongue and a kind heart. She arrived with a bottle of cheap red wine and a look of genuine curiosity. I thought you didn't cook anymore, she said. I thought so too, I replied. We ate until the plates were clean and the air was thick with warmth. Afterward, she leaned back in her chair and said, You should open something small again, a cafe maybe. Not for them, for you. I laughed, but the idea landed somewhere deep. I spent the next few weeks thinking about it, sketching notes in the margins of my old ledger, the one the manager had later returned to me quietly, saying he thought it belonged at home. I reread my old recipes and realized that each one was a letter to my younger self, written in the language of survival. I didn't need a cafe, not really. What I needed was to feel capable again. So I started cooking for the community shelter twice a week. The first night, when I served bowls of stew to a room full of strangers, a young man looked up and said, This tastes like something my grandmother used to make. The words hit me harder than he could know. That was the first moment in years when I felt not just remembered, but useful in a way that didn't require permission. My son found out, of course. Word travels fast in small cities. He called furious again, asking why I was embarrassing the family by cooking for charity cases. I listened quietly and then said, Because they eat with gratitude, Daniel. That's a kind of currency you've forgotten how to earn. He hung up on me. I sat there for a while afterward, looking at the phone as if it might ring again, but it didn't. It no longer mattered. His disapproval used to wound me. Now it only confirmed what I already knew, that I had finally stepped out of the cage he built from good intentions and guilt. In late autumn, the Culinary Guild invited me again to their gala. This time I accepted, not out of pride, but out of curiosity. I arrived wearing the navy coat, polished shoes, and a necklace my husband had given me when the restaurant first broke even. The hall was filled with bright lights, familiar faces aged by time and regret. When they called my name, I walked to the podium with a steady gait. I thanked them for recognizing the women who built kitchens before they built reputations, and then I said something that surprised even me. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what refuses to leave you. The audience applauded politely, some genuinely, others because applause was the safest reaction. But I didn't care. I was done performing for comfort. That was the turning point, the midpoint, though I didn't know it yet. I had stopped fighting to be included in their story and started authoring my own. It wasn't a grand transformation, not the kind that comes with trumpets or redemption arcs. It was quieter, steadier, the way a river shifts its course over years until one day you look down and realize it's flowing somewhere new. The next morning, I found myself humming as I brewed coffee. The light through the window fell across the oak table, golden and sure. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was sitting at a table that belonged entirely to me. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year, rolling in with a wind so sharp it felt like an insult whispered against the skin. The sea turned a darker gray, the kind that absorbs light instead of reflecting it, and the streets emptied faster in the evenings. My apartment grew smaller in the cold, the windows fogging with my own breath, the floorboards creaking like they, too, were remembering something. I had grown used to my quiet routine, the shelter meals twice a week, the market on Sundays, the solitude that no longer felt like punishment. And I believed, foolishly, that peace had finally settled around me. But peace is never permanent for women like me. It always arrives late, stays briefly, and then leaves the moment you start to believe it belongs to you. It began with a phone call from the manager, the kind of hesitant voice that carries bad news wrapped in apology. He told me there had been an incident at the restaurant. A reporter had approached the staff, asking questions about ownership and legacy, the kind that make people nervous when they have something to hide. My son had been there, apparently, and had responded harshly, claiming the story about me was exaggerated, that I had been a helpful figure in the early years, but not a founder in the modern sense. The words tasted like ash, even as the manager repeated them softly, as though trying to protect me from their sharp edges. I thanked him for letting me know, hung up the phone, and sat at my table for a long time, staring at the window, where condensation blurred the world into a watercolor of absence. I had thought we'd reached a kind of uneasy truce, that after the gala and the renewed interest from the public, he'd finally stopped trying to erase me. But erasure is addictive. Once people discover how easy it is to remove you, they can't resist doing it again. For several days, I avoided reading the papers, but curiosity, that stubborn old companion, eventually won. The article was polite, careful, the way all betrayals are when they're dressed as professionalism. It praised my inspirational beginnings and then subtly repositioned my son as the visionary leader who transformed a humble eatery into a modern institution. They quoted him directly. "My mother laid the foundation, but it was my generation that built the success." I read that sentence over and over until the words blurred. Foundation, success, as if I were the dirt beneath the house, not the architect of its walls. I could almost hear his voice as I read it, that clipped tone he used whenever he wanted to sound rational while delivering cruelty. I felt something in me harden, not in anger, but in recognition. This was the final stage of their version of history, the part where I would be preserved in sentimental language, embalmed as a figure of gratitude, safely dead while still breathing. The next week brought another reminder of my invisibility. The shelter where I volunteered had invited the restaurant to participate in a charity dinner. They agreed, of course, since it made for good publicity. I arrived early that evening to help prepare, and when I walked into the hall, I saw the banner stretched across the stage. Petra's, Feeding Hope. The irony almost made me laugh. My own name, repurposed as marketing. I watched as my son and his wife arrived, all smiles and polished courtesy. They moved through the crowd like dignitaries, greeting donors, posing for photographs. When he saw me by the kitchen door, his expression faltered. He approached quickly, speaking in the same low tone he used when we used to argue behind closed doors. "Mom, please don't make tonight about you," he said. This isn't the place. I wanted to ask him where exactly my place was, since every room I entered seemed to become forbidden the moment I arrived. But I only nodded and turned away. The evening unfolded with the precision of an event designed for optics. Guests dined, speeches were made, cameras flashed. The food came from the restaurant's kitchen, though I could taste none of my old recipes in it. It was elegant, sterile, soulless, the culinary equivalent of good posture. When it was my turn to serve, one of the volunteers whispered, "It's incredible that you still help here, even with your age." I smiled, because what else can you do when praise disguises itself as diminishment? My hands moved automatically, ladling stew into bowls, the smell of broth mixing with perfume and self-congratulation. And then, as if fate were staging a cruel theater, the reporter who had written the recent article appeared. She recognized me immediately, crossing the room with that bright expression journalists wear when they sense drama. "Ms. Rivera," she said, "what an honor. Could we have a photo of you with your son? It would mean so much to readers, to see the then and the now together." Before I could answer, my son stepped between us. "Not tonight," he said firmly, his hand tightening on my arm in a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance. I felt the pressure of his fingers, that old need to control even my silence. The photographer hesitated, uncertain, then moved away. The moment passed, but the air between us thickened. "Why are you doing this?" he asked under his breath. "Doing what?" I replied. "Existing?" His jaw clenched. "You think this helps you? That people will suddenly love you for playing the victim? You're embarrassing yourself." His words were calm, deliberate, and meant to pierce without leaving marks. I almost pitied him. It must be exhausting to spend your life protecting a narrative built on denial. Later that night, after the event ended and the hall emptied, I stayed behind to help clean. My son and his wife had already left, swept away by their entourage of compliments. I stood by the doorway, watching the volunteers stack chairs, and one of them, a young woman with tired eyes and flour on her sleeve, approached me. "Are you really the Petra from the sign?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled shyly. "My grandmother used to take me to your restaurant when I was a kid. She said it was the first place that made her feel welcome after she moved here." "Thank you for that." Then she walked away before I could answer, leaving me standing in the echo of gratitude I hadn't heard in years. That was the moment I decided something had to change. Gratitude from strangers was sweet, but I didn't want to live on borrowed memories anymore. I wanted my truth to stand upright again, in daylight, where everyone could see it. In the following days, I began gathering what little documentation I still had: old licenses, invoices, photographs, letters from suppliers. The ledger, of course, was my treasure, thick with my handwriting and the daily pulse of those early years. I made copies of everything and placed them in a neat folder. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but instinct told me to prepare. I visited the small law office 2 blocks from my apartment, the same one that had handled our original lease long ago. The lawyer, a woman about my granddaughter's age, listened carefully as I explained my situation. "So you're not looking for money?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm looking for truth." She smiled faintly. "Truth is harder to win than money." I told her I had been fighting harder things all my life. She agreed to review the documents. A week later, she called to tell me that my name had never been legally removed from the business registration. The transfer of ownership had been filed incorrectly. Technically, I was still listed as a partner. My breath caught in my throat. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said, "that you have rights." For a few days, I said nothing to anyone. I wanted to hold the knowledge privately, to savor it like a secret recipe. Power, even the smallest taste of it, is intoxicating when you've lived without it for too long. I began to walk differently, shoulders back, steps deliberate. When I passed the restaurant on my way to the market, I didn't lower my eyes. One morning, I stopped right in front of it and looked through the glass. My son was inside, talking animatedly to a group of investors. I watched him gesture toward the space, the walls, the menu, as if presenting a kingdom. He didn't see me, of course. People rarely do until they're forced to. I thought of walking in, of saying nothing, just standing there until someone remembered who I was. But I didn't. Not yet. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. The lawyer sent a formal notice requesting a review of ownership records, and within days, my phone rang again. It was my son, furious, voice hoarse with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" he shouted. "You're trying to destroy everything we've built." I corrected him softly. "Everything I built." He began talking over me, spitting words like betrayal and insanity, but I stayed calm. "Daniel," I said finally, "you've taken enough. I just want acknowledgement. You can keep your investors, your menus, your headlines. I just want the truth printed where everyone can see it." He was silent for a moment, then laughed bitterly. "You'll regret this. You have no idea what kind of mess you're starting." I told him I had lived through bigger messes than his ego. Then I hung up. The following week, letters went out. The board of directors received notification of the ownership review, and suddenly my name began circulating again. Not as nostalgia, but as fact. The press caught wind of it, and a few local blogs began publishing pieces with headlines like, "The Real Story Behind Petra's Legacy." The attention made my son desperate. He called, not to apologize, but to threaten lawsuits, public embarrassment, anything that might scare me into silence. I didn't flinch. You stop fearing humiliation once you've already been humiliated enough to survive it. Then, one gray afternoon, he appeared at my apartment. I hadn't seen him in months, and the sight of him standing in the hallway took my breath away. He looked older, though anger still sharpened his features. "Can we talk?" he asked. I let him in. He didn't sit. He walked around the small living room like a stranger inspecting a museum of the obsolete. "Why can't you just let things be?" he asked. "Because they're not being, they're becoming lies," I replied. He turned toward me, his eyes tired. "You're going to ruin us," I said quietly. "If truth ruins you, then you built yourself on fraud." He didn't answer. For a long time we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with everything we'd never said. His resentment, my regret, the years wasted pretending love and respect were the same thing. Finally he said, "You've made your point." I looked at him and smiled sadly. "No, Daniel, I've only just begun." After he left, I felt a calm so deep it frightened me. There's a strange peace that comes from losing the last illusion. I knew he would fight me, that he would twist the story again, but I also knew that something irreversible had shifted. The next morning, I walked to the restaurant one last time, before the storm of lawyers and journalists could begin. I arrived just before opening, when the staff were still setting tables. The manager saw me and hesitated, then walked over. "Would you like to sit, Ms. Rivera?" he asked gently. I nodded. He led me to my old corner table by the window. The sunlight fell across it exactly as it had the first day I'd opened the doors. I ordered coffee. When he brought it, he paused and said, "They'll remember this, you know, no matter what happens next." I smiled. That's the point. As I sat there, I realized the second act of my life wasn't about reclaiming property or winning recognition. It was about ending a pattern, refusing the quiet extinction that women of my generation were trained to accept as grace. I didn't need to shout or dramatize. My existence was the confrontation. And in that moment, surrounded by walls I had once painted with my own hands, I felt something close to forgiveness. Not for him, but for myself. For all the years I mistook patience for love and silence for peace. I paid my bill, left a tip larger than necessary, and walked into the cold afternoon, knowing that everything from here on would be mine again, even the fight that awaited me. The morning of the hearing arrived with a light drizzle, the kind that blurs edges and makes the city seem softer than it is. I woke before dawn, not out of anxiety but out of habit. I boiled water for coffee, ironed my blouse, and stood for a long while before the mirror, studying the face that would walk into that room. It was a strong face still, marked by time but not defeated by it, lined with the map of everything I had built and lost and built again. I thought of my husband, of the way he used to touch my chin and say, "You were born to outlast things." Perhaps he had seen this day even then, though I never could have. The papers were laid out neatly in my bag, the deed, the business registration, the letters, the photographs, proof, but more than that, testimony. I didn't dress to impress. I dressed the way a woman dresses when she knows she doesn't owe anyone reverence anymore. The hearing was held in a municipal building that smelled faintly of old paper and damp coats. My lawyer met me at the entrance, her expression calm, professional, with a trace of protectiveness. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for 40 years, I replied, and we both smiled at the quiet absurdity of it. Inside the conference room, a long table divided the space between past and present. On one side sat my son and his counsel, immaculate in dark suits, eyes sharp and guarded. On the other side, me and my lawyer, two women surrounded by the hum of male impatience. The board members, 3 middle-aged bureaucrats and 1 young woman taking notes, looked like people who had sat through 1,000 small domestic wars disguised as paperwork. But this was not paperwork. This was memory made legal. When the chairperson began the proceedings, the air felt dense with all the years that had led to this point. My son's lawyer spoke first, weaving a speech of measured politeness, emphasizing evolution, modernization, and continuity of brand. He referred to me as Mrs. Rivera instead of Ms., as though I were a historical artifact, and smiled each time he said it. He described my contribution as foundational inspiration, a phrase so sterilized it almost sounded medical. I listened in silence, my hands resting flat on the table, feeling the pulse of my own patience. When he finished, my lawyer rose and began to read from the documents we'd assembled. Contracts, invoices, my signature on every foundational paper, tax receipts, even a letter from the original landlord confirming the first lease under my name. The facts built themselves like stones, one after another, solid, undeniable. Then she turned to me. "Would you like to speak, Ms. Rivera?" she asked. The room shifted slightly, attention turning, eyes sharpening. I rose slowly, steadying myself on the table, not because I was weak, but because I wanted them to see that steadiness earned over a lifetime is more commanding than any performance of confidence. "I don't have much to add," I began. "The papers speak clearly, but I want to remind everyone here that a restaurant is not just a business. It's a heartbeat. It remembers the hands that built it, the people who fed others when they had nothing themselves, the nights spent worrying over bills and recipes, and the dignity of those who worked there. I don't want anyone's empire. I just want the truth to stand where it belongs, upright with my name attached to it." I saw my son's face harden, his jaw tightening with the same expression he used to wear as a boy when caught lying. He leaned forward and said, "Mom, no one's denying what you did. We're just trying to move forward. You can't live in the past." I turned toward him and said, "You keep calling it the past. because you don't have to live with what it cost. But for me, it's not the past. It's my body, my hands, my years. You can't move forward by stepping on the person who laid the path for you. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them coughed. The young woman writing notes paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering. Then the chairperson asked the question that decided everything. Do you have proof of ownership or contribution beyond what's been presented? My lawyer nodded toward me. I opened my bag and took out the ledger. Its cover was worn smooth from decades of touch, the edges frayed, pages thickened with grease and time. I placed it on the table and opened it to the first page. The handwriting, my handwriting, marched across the paper in faded ink. Inventory, March 3rd, 1985, it read. Purchased 2 crates of tomatoes, borrowed $50 from Carlo, promised to repay by end of month. I flipped through page after page, recipes, notes, staffing schedules, small frustrations and triumphs. This is the real history, I said. It's not glamorous. It's not printed on glossy paper, but it's the truth, and it carries my name. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the faint sound of paper shifting under air conditioning, and I could feel something in the atmosphere change, like a current reversing direction. My son's lawyer cleared his throat, muttered something about informal records, but his voice lacked conviction. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the chairperson asked to review the ledger, and I handed it over carefully, as if passing a living thing. They read silently for several minutes, their faces softening, the bureaucratic detachment slowly replaced by a quiet respect. When they were done, the chairperson looked up and said, "It appears there's no doubt, Ms. Rivera, that your contribution was foundational in every sense of the word." My son opened his mouth to protest, but the chairperson raised a hand. Legally speaking, the original ownership has not been properly transferred. You remain a named partner. The words landed like a bell, tolling in slow motion. Partner. Not employee, not inspiration, not relic. Partner. My son looked at me, disbelief flickering across his features, followed by something rawer. Fear, perhaps, or shame. "You planned this," he said under his breath. I met his gaze evenly. "No," I said. "You did, when you forgot who I was." After the hearing, the board adjourned, and people began gathering their papers. My lawyer squeezed my shoulder, a quiet gesture of triumph. "Congratulations," she whispered, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like release. I walked out into the rain and stood under the overhang, letting the air cool my face. The world seemed oddly still, as if waiting for me to decide what came next. My son followed me out a few minutes later. He looked smaller somehow, his certainty stripped away. "You could have asked," he said quietly. "I would have given you anything." I turned to him. I didn't want anything given. I wanted what was mine not to be taken. He nodded once, unable to meet my eyes, and walked away without another word. That night, I went back to the restaurant. I hadn't planned to, but my feet carried me there the way memory carries water back to the source. The lights inside were low, the staff cleaning up after dinner service. The manager saw me through the glass and quickly came to unlock the door. "You heard," he said, smiling faintly. I nodded. "Yes." He gestured to the empty dining room. "Would you like to sit?" I walked to my old corner table. The air was thick with the smell of garlic and simmered wine, the same scent that had once lived in my hair and clothes every day. I sat down, rested my hands on the table, and felt an odd calm spread through me. The manager brought a small plate from the kitchen, bread, olive oil, a bit of roast. "On the house," he said. I tasted it, And though the recipe had changed, the essence was still there, buried under modern affectations. As I ate, the past folded gently around me, not as a wound, but as a tapestry. I could see the ghost of my younger self moving between tables, calling out orders, laughing with customers, alive with purpose. I didn't feel nostalgia or sadness. I felt recognition. Everything that had been taken, twisted, repackaged, it all came back in that single mouthful. Ownership was never just about paper or money. It was about memory, labor, and the quiet knowledge that you built something that endures. I finished eating, left some cash on the table, and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, I turned back to the manager. "Tomorrow," I said, "hang the old photograph again, the one with both of us in it." He nodded slowly. "I will." Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement glistened under the streetlights like wet glass. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the smell of the city, the salt, the exhaust, the faint sweetness of bread rising somewhere in the distance. I thought about the ledger now resting in my bag, about the way the board members had looked at it with something like reverence. I knew that from now on, my name would no longer be a footnote. It would be carved into the story the way it always should have been. When I reached the pier, the sky was beginning to clear, streaked with pale silver clouds. I sat on my usual bench, the wood damp but welcoming. My reflection shimmered faintly on the dark water. I realized I no longer needed anyone to tell me who I was. The city knew. The walls of that restaurant knew. The air itself seemed to carry the truth like a scent. I wasn't thinking of legacy anymore. I was thinking of peace. There's a strange kind of quiet that follows justice, not loud, not triumphant, but deep, like the earth settling after rain. I sat there until the first light began to bloom at the horizon, warm and slow, and I whispered into the wind, "It's done." And it was. Spring came late that year, hesitant and pale, as if the world itself needed time to remember how to begin again. The rains lingered longer than usual, washing the city clean in slow, deliberate strokes, and the sea grew calm, no longer bruised, but shimmering with the fragile light of forgiveness. My days fell into a new rhythm, quieter, but filled with a kind of deliberate presence I had never allowed myself before. I woke with no schedule pressing against my chest, brewed coffee slowly, and read the paper without searching for my name. When it appeared, which it sometimes still did, in small mentions, in nostalgic articles about the founder's legacy, I didn't flinch. I didn't tear the page out or save it. I had finally learned that survival is not a headline. It's the quiet persistence of breath, the luxury of peace earned molecule by molecule. The restaurant reopened under a slightly altered name a few months after the hearing, Petra's Table. My son insisted on keeping the brand alive, but he also restored the original sign above the entrance, the one with the looping gold letters I had chosen all those years ago. He didn't tell me he was going to do it. I only found out when the manager called to say the painters were outside early one morning, working in silence while the city was still half asleep. He said the staff had stood watching, some with tears in their eyes, as the old name resurfaced. "It looks right again," he told me. I thanked him and said nothing else, but that night I walked there myself. The street was quiet, washed in the orange glow of the streetlights, and the new sign gleamed softly against the dark facade. It was strange seeing my name up there again, not as a reminder of loss, but as a statement of truth, a simple declaration that what was real had survived. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Ownership had become something internal, untransferable. Once you reclaim your story, no one can repossess it. In the weeks that followed, I began to receive letters, some from old customers, others from women I'd never met. They wrote about their own small victories, about husbands and sons who had dismissed them, about projects they'd built and lost and wanted to rebuild again. One woman, a retired seamstress from the north, wrote that she had read about me in the paper and decided to reopen the tailoring shop she'd closed when her brother took over the business. She said, "You reminded me that I'm not done yet." I kept her letter on the kitchen table for weeks, rereading it whenever doubt returned, because it reminded me that the meaning of my fight had stretched beyond my own walls. Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not statues or plaques or headlines, but the quiet permission your story gives to another woman to begin again. One afternoon in late May, my granddaughter came to see me. I hadn't expected her. I heard the knock and assumed it was the mailman. When I opened the door, there she stood, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. She looked nervous, older than I remembered, as if the past year had forced her to grow into honesty. We stood awkwardly in the doorway for a few seconds before she said, "May I come in?" Her voice trembled just slightly. I stepped aside. She sat at the table, glancing around the apartment as though it were a museum she'd read about but never visited. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, "for the wedding, for not inviting you properly. I didn't know the whole story then. I only knew what they told me." I watched her hands twisting in her lap, her fingers delicate and restless, and for the first time I saw not an accomplice to my son's denial, but a girl born into an edited history. "They told you I was difficult," I said quietly. She nodded. "They said you didn't want to be involved anymore." I smiled faintly. That's how stories survive, by finding a villain to make the rest seem tidy. She opened the box she'd brought and slid it toward me. Inside was a framed photograph, the original picture from the restaurant wall, restored, uncut, both my husband and I standing in the kitchen, laughing at something out of frame. "The manager gave it to me," she said. "He thought you should have it back." I traced the edge of the frame, feeling the smoothness of the wood under my fingertips, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. The image glowed softly in the afternoon light, so alive it almost seemed to breathe. "You look happy," she said softly. I nodded. I was. Happiness wasn't rare then. It was just invisible until it was gone. She hesitated, then reached across the table and touched my hand. "Would you come to dinner one night? At the restaurant, I mean. They'd like that." I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness is not an event. It's a slow migration of the heart, and I wasn't sure yet where mine had landed. "Maybe," I said, "when the time feels right." She smiled with a kind of relief that told me she hadn't expected even that much. After she left, I hung the photograph above my desk, not as a monument, but as a mirror. It reminded me daily that dignity, once reclaimed, becomes its own kind of inheritance. I no longer measured time by how long I'd been waiting to be seen. I measured it by how deeply I could feel my own presence in a room. Sometimes I still walked by the restaurant, especially in the early evening when the lights inside glowed warm and the clatter of dishes echoed faintly into the street. I liked to stand across the road, unnoticed, watching the rhythm of people eating, laughing, living inside something that had once been only a dream in my kitchen. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt like witnessing the continuation of a song that no longer needed me to sing it. In the summer, the Culinary Guild sent me another invitation, this time not for a gala, but for an archive project. They wanted to record my oral history for their permanent collection. I agreed, but on one condition, that they include the ledger, not as a prop, but as a document, every page digitized so that no one could ever erase it again. They accepted. The day of the recording, I spoke slowly, carefully, not as a woman reliving grief, but as one curating clarity. I said, "The real inheritance of work is not ownership, it's endurance. The world doesn't owe you fairness, but it owes you the right to exist without being rewritten." When it was over, the young archivist looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You sound like someone who made peace with everything," she said. I laughed softly. "Not everything," I told her, "just enough to keep living without bitterness." Now, in the quiet of my evenings, I sometimes sit by the window with a glass of wine and listen to the city hum below. The scent of food still drifts faintly through the streets, and if the wind is right, I can almost catch the echo of the laughter that once filled that restaurant. I no longer flinch when I hear it. I've learned that the sound of joy, even borrowed, even distant, can still belong to you if you built the walls that hold it. Sometimes I think of writing another letter to my son, but then I stop myself. Some stories don't need more words. They just need time to grow roots in silence. I've given him the truth, and the rest is his to live with. When the sun begins to set, the light catches the edge of the photograph above my desk and spills across the room, warm and forgiving. I look at that younger woman, the one in the picture with the flower on her hands, the tired pride in her smile, and I whisper to her the words, "I wish someone had told me then. You were never invisible. They only looked away. And when they did, you kept building. You built until they couldn't erase you anymore. That is the quiet triumph no one can take, the one that doesn't need applause." And so, when I finally turn off the lights and let the darkness settle around me, I no longer feel the weight of what was lost. I feel the pulse of everything that remains, the smell of rosemary and garlic still clinging faintly to my memory, the soft sound of dishes being stacked, the hum of a life that refused to be silenced. I think of the women who will come after me, standing at their own tables, steadying their voices, learning that survival itself can be an art. To them, I would say only this: do not wait to be seen. Existence is not a gift someone gives you. It's the proof you make with every breath. And when they laugh, when they doubt, when they try to erase, remember that the foundation is still yours, and nothing built on your labor can ever truly stand without your name holding it upright. Then, with that quiet knowing, live,